The North is cold and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube. All on our Patreon. Jon woke before the castle did. He lay on his back in the gray dark and did not move. The ceiling above him was Winterfell stone, the same low vault of rough-cut granite he had stared at since he was old enough to stare at things. The same iron wall bracket gone orange with old rust. The same crack splitting the mortar from the bracket to the north corner that he had memorized, as a boy by studying it in candlelight when sleep would not come. The familiar smell of the room, cold stone and tallow, and the faint animal warmth of the furs piled heavy over his chest. He was 15 years old. He was also something else entirely. The memories did not sort themselves. They came at once. Not a rising tide, but a wall of water, a lifetime's weight arriving in a single breath. The wall, 700 feet of blue-gray ice above the tree line, a thing that dwarfed every human purpose built beside it. The wildlings beyond it, their fires in the dark, the cave and the heat, and the woman whose name he would not speak right now. He pressed it flat before it could fully form, held his breath until the pressure of it passed. The election. The cloak settling onto shoulders that had not asked for it. The weight of command that did not get lighter, only familiar. And then the courtyard. That other cold. The wrong cold. The one that had nothing to do with North and everything to do with Ollie's face and the first blade going in below the ribs and the color leaving the world in slow exact stages until there was no world left. He should be dead. He pressed one hand to his stomach, then his chest, then his ribs, whole, every one of them whole, the unmarked body of a boy who had never once felt steel in the dark. He lay still and breathed and let the two lives settle through each other, like two pieces of parchment held together against the light, until he could see both at once without either one bleeding into the other. It took longer than he expected. Somewhere across the castle, up 2 flights of stairs, and behind the door he had knocked at his entire life without ever simply opening it, Robb Stark would be sitting up in the dark with his hand pressed flat against a chest that did not carry the wounds that should have killed him. The crossbow bolts, the dagger between the ribs, Roose Bolton's voice saying the Lannisters sent their regards. Jon rose. He dressed without lighting a candle. Ghost was waiting at the door. The direwolf lifted his head when Jon came near, the red eyes catching the gray light under the door and holding it without effort. He made no sound. He rarely made sound unless he chose to. But he looked at Jon with the patient, settled calm of something that understood more than it could say, and Jon read the look and said quietly to the empty corridor, "I know." Ghost turned and padded ahead of him. Jon followed, through the sleeping castle, toward the Godswood. Robb was already there. He stood at the pool's edge with his arms at his sides, looking down at the black water. The sky above the weirwood was the particular gray of the hour before dawn decides to commit to anything. He was wearing his practice clothes. Rough wool, worn leathers, not what he would have chosen on a normal morning. He had grabbed what was nearest. Jon understood that. He had done the same. Robb did not turn when Jon's boots found the wet grass of the Godswood. He said to the water, "Tell me something only you would know about me." Jon stopped a few feet back. The heart tree rose above them both, its trunk the white of old bone in the gray light, the carved face watching from above, with its red cuts weeping old sap. The weirwood had watched the Starks do everything that Starks had ever done. Jon did not know whether the gods were in it. He did not know whether that mattered. "You broke a marriage pact," Jon said. "You knew what it cost and you paid it anyway. She was with child when she died at the Twins." A pause. "You had already chosen the name." Robb went completely still. "That's enough," he said. "Your turn." Robb breathed out through his nose, the breath misting in the cold air. Sam stood up in front of the entire hall and gave a speech nominating you. Nobody expected it, and you didn't ask for it. You were the 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and you earned no single vote of it, by wanting it. He looked at the water. You put an arrow through Mance Rayder's heart to spare him the burning. Stannis had ordered the fire, and you couldn't watch it done slowly. The wall fell. Not from the south, from the east. A dead dragon brought it down at Eastwatch, and the Night King walked through the gap with 100,000 dead behind him. At Hardhome you found that Valyrian steel kills them. One White Walker, one sword, in the middle of a massacre on a frozen shore, and the Night King watched from the docks and raised every corpse on the beach for an answer. At Winterfell he walked into the castle grounds, and you were 50 feet from him with your sword drawn and you could not reach him. He raised his arms. They all rose. It was Arya who killed him. A dagger in the dark, coming from nowhere, and he never saw her. He looked up. You died in a courtyard at Castle Black. Knives, not swords. The one you didn't expect was the last. The Godswood was quiet. That's enough, Jon said. They looked at each other across 2 feet of cold air, across everything that had happened and been taken and somehow been returned, and neither of them moved. The Heart Tree watched. Grey Wind was a dark shape in the grass to Robb's right, Grey Wind who was alive and would stay alive if they did this right. And Ghost stood at Jon's left and said nothing, and neither did either of them for a moment that stretched and held. The things they were not saying lived in the space between the trees. It was not silence, exactly. It was the weight of everything deliberately left unspoken. The names, the faces, the specific shape each of them had been broken into. Before whatever this was had put them back, Jon did not say her name. He had made that decision when he opened his eyes, and he would not unmake it. He felt the absence of it the way he felt the cold, which was not intermittently but always and from every direction at once, and he breathed through it and did not speak it. Robb did not say hers either. Some things were too close to what needed doing to be looked at directly yet. We don't know how, Robb said. No, it doesn't matter. No, Jon said. It doesn't. Robb crouched at the pool's edge, picked up a piece of gravel, turned it over once, and let it drop. The ripple spread outward and was gone. He stood. When he spoke again, his voice had the quality Jon had heard from him across a dozen war councils that no longer existed. Calm, considered, already past the part where the problem feels like a problem, and into the part where it becomes a sequence of steps. The feast is today, Robb said. 300 Southerners and 70 Lannister guards. Nothing happens today. Robert arrives, we eat, we say the right things. Robert is an asset right now. Right now, Jon agreed. Tomorrow morning, Jaime and Cersei use the broken tower. They've used it 3 times already during the visit, and they'll use it again at dawn because they believe they're invisible in there. Robb's voice was flat and precise. We put Robert in front of it instead. I'll have the household guards positioned before the sun rises. You manage Robert the night before, the invitation. He responds to soldiers. Talk to him like a soldier, and he'll walk anywhere you ask him to walk. He'll want Ned with him. Father goes. He knows something is coming. I've told him to have the men ready. He doesn't know what. That's enough for now. Jon nodded. After the arrest, everything accelerates. Tywin is 6 weeks away from here, and the moment a raven reaches Casterly Rock, he marches. The North needs to be locked before he hears anything. I've been thinking about the letters since I opened my eyes this morning. Robb said it without any particular pride. It was simply a fact. Umber, Karstark, the Glovers, Manderley, I know what each of them needs to hear. I'll frame it as winter readiness, which it is. A pause. Bolton gets the supply lines. Jon looked at him. The worst post in the army, Robb said simply. The one where he can betray me the least. Good. Jon exhaled. In King's Landing there are 2 men who matter. Littlefinger will sell whatever trust you put in him before the ink is dry on any agreement you make. Don't put any in him. He's a dead man who doesn't know it yet. Varys is more complicated. He wants a Targaryen on the throne. He's been building toward it for years. Approach him correctly and he becomes the most valuable asset in the South. Approach him wrong and he disappears. Jon looked at the pool, at the black water that reflected nothing now, and Robert has to be managed carefully. He's an asset today. He becomes a liability the moment he knows too much too soon. You mean about you? Jon was quiet. Father has to tell you, Robb said. The realm needs a king, Jon, not an heir and a bastard. A king and his hand, that's what we are. He said it without ceremony. The sooner it's out of Father's chest, the better. Jon looked at the heart tree, at the carved eyes, at the long red tears dried in the pale wood. Agreed, he said. Robb met his eyes. We don't swear on honor. We know what honor costs. Yes, we swear on results, on the work. Robb's voice didn't rise. Jon manages the South, the politics, the throne when we get to it. Robb holds the North and the army. Nothing significant moves without the other knowing. And no one, not father, not mother, not anyone in that castle, hears a word about what we carry or why we carry it. He paused once. We are not returned souls, we are 2 brothers who are paying attention. Jon looked at him across the Godswood, across the black pool and the 2 direwolves breathing quietly in the wet grass, and the ghost of everything they had already survived, and nodded. Agreed, he said. They stood a moment longer. The Heart Tree watched. The sky above Winterfell bled from gray into something that was not yet light, but was no longer fully dark. Then Robb turned and walked back toward the castle, and Jon watched him go, and did not move until he had disappeared through the Godswood Gate. They separated before first light. The castle would wake soon. The feast began today. Torchlight off silver plate, the smell of roasted boar and damp northern rushes, and the sour, warm bite of the Dornish red that Robert had ordered brought up from his wagons. Jon sat at his place at the long table and ate what was put in front of him and said what needed saying, and watched. He watched Cersei Lannister. She sat 3 places from Robert at the high table, and the smile she wore for the room was a thing she had built rather than felt. Exact, tireless, deployed like a siege weapon on a fixed rotation. Jon had seen behind it in another life, by the time it was too late to do anything useful with the knowledge. He watched it now with the particular distance of someone who has already read the last page and is noting for the first time every sentence that pointed toward it. He watched Jaime. The Kingslayer sat at the edge of the high table in his white armor with the posture of a man who had decided at some formative point that every room he entered would arrange itself around him. He was laughing at something. His teeth were very good. He caught Jon looking once and gave a slight, comfortable nod. The acknowledgement of a knight for a boy not worth more acknowledgement than that. Jon held the look one beat and moved on. He watched Joffrey. The prince had made a servant flinch twice in the last hour over spilled wine. He was 12 years old, and the hall was treating him like a jewel set in gold. And he had learned at some early age that other people existed primarily to be arranged according to his preferences. He would be king. Jon ate a piece of bread and kept his face still. He watched Tyrion. The dwarf sat at the far end of the high table drinking heavily but not carelessly, which was a different thing entirely. The cup was something his hands did while his eyes did something else. Those eyes moved across the room with the patient, constant sweep of a man who has learned that the thing no one is watching is usually the most important thing in any gathering. He was the least powerful person at the high table by every formal measure. Jon did not underestimate Tyrion Lannister. He had not. Even the first time, across the long table, Robb was everything a young lord should be at a royal feast. Attentive, warm when Robert addressed him, deferential without being servile. He was talking with a southern knight about horses. His eyes had not moved to Jon in 2 hours, which was exactly right. They were strangers tonight the way 2 men can be strangers when there is specific work to do, and being strangers is part of how the work gets done. Robert drank. The hall was loud. The knight moved. Jon found his moment when the feast had reached the stage where the musicians were being shouted over and the floor between tables had been claimed by 2 drunk knights arguing at volume. Robert had pushed back from the high table and was standing near the eastern window with a full cup and the expression of a man who prefers the memory of his wars to the present reality of his peace. Jon moved to the window and stood beside him and looked out at the dark inner yard without preamble. "You took pike from the sea," Jon said. He kept his voice low, conversational, the tone of one military man noting a fact to another. "I've read about the campaign. Most lords come at island fortifications from the land. You came by water." Robert looked at him. He liked being talked to about fighting. He always had. Pike from the sea, Balon from the walls. Balon had more sense than his brothers, surrendered before I could finish it properly. He drank. "Your father was there. He doesn't talk about it. Ned doesn't talk about anything." Robert said it with a depth of feeling that made it almost a complaint and almost a declaration of love simultaneously. "Finest man I ever knew, and he keeps everything he feels like it belongs to the castle walls." He studied Jon sideways. "You're the same. You know that?" Jon let it stand. After a moment, the broken tower in the eastern inner wall. Lightning took the top of it 15 years ago. It was the first defensive structure this castle had. Built before the Starks had a proper outer wall. You can see the whole northern approach from the base, if the light is right. He paused. "Before the castle wakes, if you wanted to see how this family has held the north for 8,000 years, that approach tells the story better than any record does." Something shifted in Robert's eyes. The part of him that had been a soldier once and still remembered what a soldier's eye was for. "Before light," he said, "before light, you see it better in the gray, before the sun changes the angles." Jon met his gaze. "I'll ask Lord Stark to join us." Robert studied him for a moment with a directness that was very nearly uncomfortable, the assessment of a man who cannot quite name what he is assessing, and then he nodded and drank and turned back to the room. Jon moved away from the window without hurrying. He did not look at Robb. Robb did not look at him. Dawn came in stages. First the dark turning gray at the edges, then the gray spreading west across Winterfell's walls, leaching the color from every surface until the stone and the sky were the same exhausted pewter. The yard torches were still burning. They would burn until someone decided they were unnecessary. Robb was already moving. He crossed the outer yard in practice clothes, dressed for early training, which gave him reason to be anywhere without explaining why. The Lannister guard captain was a Westerlands man named Swift, efficient, professional, the kind of man who responds to a lord's request the way water responds to a slope. Robb found him outside the barracks and told him, with the easy authority of someone who had never once considered that his instructions might not be followed, that 3 of the Lannister horses had shown stiffness in the near forelegs since the journey north, and that the Stark stablemaster had requested a Lannister man present for the assessment. Swift received this as a matter of course. He went to the stables, the main gate was doubled, the household guard, 40 men briefed the previous evening in 4 separate groups of 10, in intervals staggered to prevent the briefings from looking like a briefing, took their places at the corridor intersections of the inner keep. Not battle posts, nothing that would register as a threat to anyone looking, just presence. Just 40 men standing in the right places in case something needed to happen quickly. The broken tower waited in the eastern corner of the inner walls, its top missing where the lightning had found it, its door still on its hinges from habit rather than function. Nothing in it worth entering for. Nothing in it worth climbing to. Jon walked with Robert and Ned across the frost-stiffened flagstones of the inner yard, and Robert's breath came in short, heavy clouds in the cold air, his body still carrying the previous night in the set of his shoulders and the careful placement of his feet on the uneven stones. He had dressed quickly. The fur cloak was thrown over his underlayer, the boots not properly laced. He looked like a man who had once been the most physically formidable person in any room he entered, and had made an ongoing series of private agreements with himself about what that still meant. "I forget how gray everything is up here," Robert said, looking up at the walls. "Gray stone, gray sky." He glanced at Ned. "Gray people." "Your grace is very perceptive," Ned said. "Gray people excluding present company." Robert clapped Ned's shoulder with enough force to shift him half a step. "Ned Stark is the grayest man alive, and somehow he's still my favorite person." He said it the way he said everything real, quickly, without decoration, as though the truth was embarrassing to linger on. He talked about the Greyjoy rebellion as they crossed the yard. He talked about the approach to Pike, and the cold of the sunset sea in autumn, and the moment he had known it was over. He was almost worth knowing in these moments. Jon walked half a step behind him and listened and said nothing and thought about what Robert's face was going to look like in 4 minutes. Ned walked to Jon's left and said almost nothing. His jaw held the particular set of a man who has been told that something is coming without being told what, and is mapping the shape of it by working through the quality of the silence he has been given. They heard the voices before they reached the tower door. Robert stopped walking. The voices came from 1 level up, behind the window set into the tower's eastern face, the wooden shutter long gone. 1 man's voice and 1 woman's voice, low, unhurried, close. The voices of people who believed themselves completely alone. Robert turned and looked at Jon. Jon's face held nothing. He had arranged it with care before leaving the castle. It communicated only that he had stopped because Robert had stopped and was waiting for whatever Robert chose to do next. Robert looked at Ned. Ned was looking at the window in the tower wall with an expression that had stopped being the expression of a man receiving information and had become the expression of a man watching his worst private suspicion take physical form. Robert did not call out. He did not reach for a weapon. He put his hand on the tower door and opened it and went up. The stairs were worn stone. 15 steps, the walls close on both sides and damp to the touch. Jon stayed at the bottom. He did not go up. He did not need to, and he had not needed to plan for what came next. He had only needed to plan for this moment, and the moment had arrived and everything after it would move at a speed that planning could not improve. Robert's footsteps on the stairs. Then silence. The silence held for 3 seconds. Then the sound Robert Baratheon made was not a word and not a shout. It was below language, the sound a great structure makes in the moment before it decides how to fall. What followed came in fragments through the open doorway. Movement. Robert's voice thickened with something too large to be shaped into speech. Jaime's voice, controlled, calculating, the voice of a man making rapid assessments. Then Ned, who had gone up the stairs behind Robert, sang the 2 words that Jon had told him the previous night, standing in the dim corridor outside the solar, that he would need to say, "Robert." A pause. The law, then quieter, "Not like this." A silence, heavy and terrible. Then Robert's footsteps on the stairs coming down, and Ned's behind him. And Robert emerged through the tower door into the gray morning, with his hand on his dagger hilt and his face hollowed out in a way that no amount of wine or time could account for. From the inner courtyard, Robb Stark's voice came across the frost-stiffened yard, clear and flat and carrying the absolute, specific certainty of someone whose instructions were already in motion 20 minutes before he issued them. By the king's order, no one moves. The words went upward through the open window and into the tower room. They reached Cersei Lannister, who stood against the far wall with her hands at her sides and her face already reconstructed, already rebuilding behind her eyes whatever the last few minutes had cost. She heard the voice. She measured the voice. She heard in it the quality of something arranged in advance, and she understood, with the cold mechanical precision that had always been her sharpest attribute, that the boy who had walked her husband to this tower at first light had known, before he extended the invitation, exactly what would be found inside it. This had been planned. She looked at Jaime. He looked back at her with the eyes of a man who has just recalculated and found the new sum considerably worse than the old one. The game, for now, was over. 2 words. That was all Robert said, and Ned Stark translated them into an army. Take them. The Stark household guard at Winterfell numbered 200 men. The Lannister escort distributed through the castle at various posts since the previous day numbered 70. Robb had been moving since before dawn, and by the time the order reached the yard, the Lannister guardsmen found at every exit and intersection the specific quality of stillness that means a decision has already been made on your behalf and in your absence. The math was legible to every professional soldier present. The Lannister guards stood down, not from cowardice, but from the cold arithmetic of men who understood that dying against 200 Stark spears in a northern courtyard, for an order their own king had countermanded with 2 words, solved nothing that was worth the cost of solving. They were disarmed. They were moved to the outer yard under guard, which was not imprisonment but was not freedom either, and the gate was doubled behind them. Jaime Lannister came down from the tower in the clothes he had managed to find in the previous 4 minutes. Breeches, boots, a shirt with the laces undone, no armor, no sword. He walked out into the morning gray with the deliberate bearing of a man performing the act of not running, which is its own distinct thing from a man who has no urge to run. When the Stark guardsmen moved forward with the shackles, Jaime looked at them, not at the guardsmen, at the shackles for the space of 2 or 3 seconds, the precise amount of time it takes a certain kind of mind to do a full accounting of a yard. The exits, the guards, the numbers, the king somewhere above him who had given the order. Then he put his hands out. He did not fight. Jon had known he would not. The finest sword in the 7 kingdoms was unarmed and outnumbered, and the man who wanted him dead was the man whose oath he had once sworn, and the math was worse than the outer yard math by a considerable margin. Jaime Lannister was too precise a calculator to die against these odds for no return. Jon noted it and stored it, the way he had noted it the first time and then lost it in the press of everything else. Jaime will always look for a better moment. The work, from here, was never to give him one. Cersei was a different matter entirely. She came down from the tower with her hair loose and her composure locked in place with the force of a woman who had been building composure as a daily practice for 2 decades. And she looked at the guards waiting in the yard and said to Ned Stark specifically and without raising her voice, "I am the Queen of the 7 Kingdoms. You will remove these men from my path." Ned's answer was measured. "A queen is subject to the king's law, my lady. The king has spoken." She looked at the guards. She looked at the doubled gate and the placement of 200 men who had been at their posts before dawn, and something moved behind her eyes, not fear, but the specific recognition of a strategist who has just identified a prepared position and understands what prepared positions mean. When the shackles went on, her hands did not shake. She would not give the North that. The hall had been cleared of servants and filled with guards, and Robert Baratheon sat in the Lord's chair at Winterfell's high table with a cup of wine he had not touched and the expression of a man whose interior landscape had been reorganized without his consent. The fire burned in the hearth. The windows let in gray morning. The room looked as it had looked yesterday and the day before, and every day of the castle's 8,000-year history. Nothing in it was the same. When the twins were brought in shackled, Robert went still, not the uncontrolled stillness of shock, the deeper, more frightening stillness of a man who has found the floor of something and is standing on it, and has not yet decided what to build on top. His rage had been loud coming down the tower stairs. Now it had gone somewhere quieter and further down. He dismissed everyone but Ned, Jon, Robb, and the two prisoners. He looked at Jaime. Jaime met the look with the steadiness of a man who has decided the performance is beneath the moment. There was nothing apologetic in his face. He was not a man who spent himself on apology. Robert seemed to understand this with the gut clarity of a fighter reading another fighter. Directly, without words, without resolution. The look landed. Robert moved on. He looked at Cersei. Whatever he had meant to say, he did not say it. His jaw moved once. His hand closed around the cup. He looked away. The silence in the hall had the quality of something being held back by a single restraint, and everyone present could hear the restraint working. Tyrion Lannister was found at breakfast in the East Wing by a Stark guardsman and escorted to the hall without explanation, which was itself a form of explanation. He arrived at the door and stood in it for a moment, reading the room before he entered. The guards, the shackles on his siblings. Robert Baratheon sitting at the high table with the look of a man who has been hit somewhere the bruise won't show. The Stark boys at the wall, watching. Tyrion crossed the threshold and walked to the center of the room because there was nothing else to do, and he looked at Robert, and Robert looked back at him. "Did you know?" Robert said. 3 words carrying 20 years of questions inside them. Tyrion understood every one. He stood very still. Jon watched him from the wall and watched the answer move through him, watched it travel through whatever internal arrangement Tyrion used to navigate the space between what was true and what could be said, and what arrived in Tyrion's face was not guilt and not innocence. It was the expression of a man who had, across years of watching his siblings at close range, built up a careful architecture of not quite knowing, of suspicions that had never been permitted to fully form, of certainties kept at the edge of thought, where they could be denied with enough sincerity to survive a direct question. He had not known. He had also, in some honest and unvisited room in himself, suspected things he had never let become suspicion. "I know only what the crown has told me, Your Grace," Tyrion said. Robert held the look for 5 seconds. Then he looked away. The answer was not everything, and it was not nothing, and it had landed precisely at the weight the room could hold. No heavier, no lighter. Jon observed this from the wall and thought, he has been surviving rooms like this one his entire life. He is very good at it. The Lannister architecture that had kept Tyrion as the embarrassment, the lesser son, the one Tywin kept at arm's length, and Cersei despised openly. All of it was rubble this morning. His siblings were in chains. He was standing in a Stark hall, having just answered the king's direct question, and survived it. He looked in this moment, the way a man looks when a cage he has occupied for so long he stopped perceiving it is no longer there. Jon watched him across the hall and felt, without wanting to examine it too closely, something adjacent to recognition. The children were brought in because Robert had said all of them, and Joffrey came first. He was 12 years old, blonde-haired, Lannister-jawed in a way that now carried specific and terrible weight in this particular hall, and he stood before the man who had called himself his father, with the expression of a boy who had grasped perhaps a third of what was happening, and whose first instinct, working from that partial understanding, was to arrange his face into something resembling contempt. Robert looked at him. The hall went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. 20 years. The boy's face, which Robert had always received as its own thing, Joffrey's face, the Crown Prince's face, the heir's face was rearranging itself now into what it had always been. Blonde where the Baratheon line ran black without exception, green-eyed where Baratheons ran blue, every bastard Robert had ever sired, acknowledged or otherwise, ran to the same dark features. Every single one, because blood tells and Baratheon blood had always told loudly. He knew this. He had always known this. He had chosen, for 20 years, the more comfortable knowledge. Robert could not speak. Jon stepped forward from the wall. He moved into the space between Robert's line of sight and the children, and addressed Ned with the quiet urgency of someone working against a clock no one else could hear. "The children should be removed from the hall, my lord. They're not part of these proceedings." Ned caught it in the same beat. "By the king's order, the children will be held under Stark guard for their protection during the legal proceedings." He said it to the room rather than to Robert, which was the right call. Robert in this moment could not have confirmed or denied anything that required words. Robert said nothing. Myrcella was frightened and held her brother Tommen's hand. Tommen did not fully understand. Joffrey's voice began to rise as the guards moved them toward the door, demanding explanation, reaching for the authority he had been trained to believe was his by arrangement, and then the door closed, and the voice receded down the corridor and was gone. Robert stared at the table. His hand had not moved. His knuckles had not whitened. That was the part that stayed with Jon. The fury had gone somewhere below the surface, somewhere it could not be reached by watching his face, and a rage that goes underground rather than out is a different problem than one that spends itself in the open. The argument came at Ned near the hearth, in the space between two guards' patrol rotations, with Robert across the room and the decision narrowing toward the obvious wrong answer. Kill them now. Robert had said it simply, to no one in particular, in the way he said things he considered settled facts. Jon was beside Ned, close enough to speak without carrying. The argument he gave Ned was the one he had built on the walk down from the tower, shaped specifically for Robert Baratheon's reasoning, for what this man respected, what he responded to, what he could be moved by when the movement was framed correctly. Not mercy, not law for its own sake, consequence. Tywin, the map. Ned delivered it to Robert without embellishment. If they die in Winterfell before any lord has seen the evidence, Tywin Lannister calls it murder and marches. If they face trial in King's Landing before witnesses by the law, every lord in Westeros sees what their gold bought them. A beat. Tywin cannot call it murder if it is justice. Robert looked at him. The fury was present in his eyes, completely present, undimmed. He was looking at the argument the way a man looks at a locked door when he is furious and late and can see, despite himself, that the lock is correct. You're saying let them live, Robert said. I'm saying let the law live, Ned said, which is not the same thing. The fire settled in the hearth. Robert was quiet for long enough that the silence developed its own weight. Then he set down the cup for the first time since the hall had emptied, and said to the guards at the door without looking at them, "They travel to King's Landing in chains. Stark guard the entire road. If either one of them reaches that city dead, the man responsible answers to me." He stood. He did not look at the prisoners. "Get them out of my sight," he said. They were taken out. Robert stood at the high table with his back to the room, looking through the window at the Winterfell courtyard below, where 200 Stark men stood at their posts and 70 disarmed Lannister guards waited between them, and he said nothing else, and no one in the hall was inclined to be the next person to speak. The decision was made, the road south was set. Somewhere in the Westerlands, in a castle of gold and limestone that had not yet received any raven, Tywin Lannister was going about his morning. That would not last. The clock had started, and Jon could hear it in the silence Robert left behind him, as clearly as if it were mounted on the wall. 6 weeks on the King's Road, and Jon mostly listened. Robert talked. That was the first thing to understand about Robert Baratheon on a long march. The man talked at volume to anyone within earshot, about the war and the hunting, and the old days before the throne had made him fat and tired. And most of his retinue responded with the specific brand of attentive laughter that courtiers deploy when they want a king to believe they are listening without actually hearing anything he says. Jon listened, not to be polite, because the man who talked without being genuinely heard was a man whose actual opinions remained unexamined, and Jon needed to understand Robert's actual opinions before he could work around them. He asked Robert about the trident. Not flatteringly, not "Your Grace was magnificent at the ford," but practically, the way one soldier asks another about the mechanics of a fight he wasn't present for. "Where did you take him in the end? The accounts say the ford, but fords are wide." Robert looked at him the first time he asked a question like this with an expression between surprise and something else. The response of a man who had spent 20 years talking to people who were performing and had just encountered someone who wasn't. After that, Robert talked to Jon differently. He described the trident in specific detail, the actual stretch of current, the moment he had understood that Rhaegar was going to commit to the duel rather than withdraw. He talked about Pike and the Stony Sept and the siege at Storm's End and the hunger of it, the particular quality of patience that a siege required from both sides, and how the side with less of it always lost first. He talked one evening with the fire going and the rest of the retinue at distance, about not having wanted the throne, about not knowing what to do with it once he had it, about having made every poor choice available to a man in that position. He said it was not something he told people, because people who heard a king say something like that immediately began calculating what it meant for them. He looked at Jon when he said it. Something moved through his face and was gone. Something in the jaw, perhaps. The particular quality of stillness the boy held under direct attention. Not the stillness of someone concealing nerves, but the stillness of someone who had nowhere else to be and was not finding the conversation uncomfortable. Robert associated it with Ned, which was what he expected to see. He looked for Ned in the boy and found it and stopped looking. He liked the boy. He did not ask himself why. Jon filed every piece of it away. King's Landing arrived the way it always did. First, the smell. A full day before the walls were visible, the smell of 200,000 people living in proximity to their own industry and their own waste, and the sea wind off Blackwater Bay that mixed with it without quite cleaning it. Then the walls, then the red keep on its hill with the afternoon light on its stones, and the banners running in the wind. Jon arrived in this city knowing its architecture in a way that had nothing to do with having been there before. He knew the Red Keep's corridors and where they led. He knew the small council chamber and who sat at which chair, and what each person sitting there was trying to accomplish, and at what price they could be moved. He knew the passages Varys used, the routes the little birds traveled through the walls, the specific places in the castle where messages could be left and retrieved, without anyone seeing who had placed or collected them. He arrived as Jon Snow, Ned Stark's natural son, brought south in the Lord Paramount's retinue. He said the right things to the right stewards and took the quarters assigned and ate at the lesser tables and gave everyone who looked at him the impression of a boy somewhat out of his depth. He was not out of his depth. He began working immediately. Varys first. Always Varys first. The Master of Whispers would be watching the new hand's arrival with the full attention he gave every shift in the political weather. He would be assessing Ned, reliable, direct, dangerous in his honesty, limited by it. He would be cataloging the implications of the Lannister arrest and what it meant for the court's architecture. He would be doing what Varys always did, which was everything at once, behind a face that gave nothing away. Jon did not approach him directly. He did not request a meeting or place himself in Varys's path. Before their first official contact in any setting, before Varys had the opportunity to assess Jon as anything beyond the hand's quiet son, Jon used one of Varys's own communication channels to leave a sealed note. The channel was a loose stone in the third-floor corridor of the Tower of the Hand, specifically, third from the left past the iron bracket where a torch had burned out and not been replaced. Behind it, a gap in the mortar wide enough for a folded piece of parchment. Jon had no clean explanation for how he knew about it. He knew, and that was what mattered. He pressed the note into the space and walked away. The note contained 3 things. The first was a description of the Tower of Joy, not the version in any public record, but the room itself. The bed, the blood soaked into stone in a pattern no account had ever specified. The scatter of dried petals on the floor, blue-gray with age, from flowers that did not grow in Dorne, and that a Stark girl had carried from the north. Details that existed in no document written by anyone who had come down from the Prince's Pass alive. The second was the name Howland Reed, with a notation of what he had witnessed at the tower and where his testimony was currently being prepared. The third was one sentence. I know what you have been building. I am the thing you have been building toward. Varys's response arrived in 12 hours, delivered by a child Jon didn't recognize to a corridor Jon was passing through with a timing too precise to be coincidental. The note was a single word. When Jon read it once. He had expected something, had expected Varys to respond, had expected the intelligence to land correctly, but the one-word response was still clarifying in a way he had needed. It was the response of a man who had been waiting for exactly this for a very long time, and had the discipline to wait a fraction longer if the situation required it. Not who are you, or prove it, or what do you want. Just when. As if the fact of Jon's existence settled every prior question and the only one that remained was timing. Jon wrote back 3 words. Not yet. Soon. He burned both notes and went to find Tyrion. Tyrion had arrived at a peculiar freedom in the weeks since Winterfell. His siblings were in custody on the road south. His father, 3 weeks west at Casterly Rock, would be receiving ravens and beginning the slow boil that would eventually express itself as an army. Tyrion himself had been asked by Ned Stark, directly, without diplomatic softening, in the manner of a man who wanted a specific thing done and had identified the specific person capable of doing it, to serve as financial counsel to the crown, while a permanent master of coin was arranged. Not counsel, Tyrion had said when the appointment was offered. Call it what it is. You need someone who can read the numbers honestly, because the alternative is trusting the man who made the numbers, and that arrangement is how you arrived at a 6 million dragon debt. Ned had said that was accurate. The ledgers arrived in 4 large chests that smelled of old parchment, and the particular must of secrets Littlefinger had felt comfortable leaving in physical form, because he had assumed no one with the relevant skills would ever actually open them. Tyrion opened them. He sat at the table in the solar with an Ironbank envoy who had made the crossing from Braavos at the new hand's formal request. a thin man named Tycho Nestoris, who had the face of someone perpetually calculating compound interest, and he worked through 7 years of the crown's financial record with the systematic patience of a man who finds the material genuinely absorbing. Jon sat against the wall and watched Tyrion's face. The face moved through stages. First, professional engagement, the quick orientation of someone mapping a system before evaluating it. Then, something that arrested, a specific quality of attention Jon had seen on craftsmen encountering technically impressive work. Tyrion held one ledger page up to the light at a particular angle and was quiet for a moment. Whoever built this, he said, to no one in particular, was an artist. He looked at what the artistry was in service of. The admiration became something else. 2 sets of figures for at least 6 years, Tyrion said. He was speaking to Nestoris now, and his voice had flattened into the register of someone communicating findings rather than opinions. Stated revenue and actual revenue. The gap between them. He set the page down precisely. What does the Iron Bank call it when a kingdom's real income is roughly a quarter less than its claimed income, compounded across a 7-year debt structure? We call it unrecoverable, Nestoris said, without significant intervention. Yes. Tyrion closed the ledger. I need originals. Every transaction Baelish authorized directly, not summaries, the originals. Jon found Janos Slynt in his office at the watch barracks on the 3rd day in the city. The room smelled of tallow and old leather, and the specific anxiety of a man waiting to learn which way a complicated situation would fall. Slynt had spent 6 years making himself useful to Cersei Lannister's power, and Cersei Lannister's power was currently shackled in a wagon somewhere on the King's Road. And men whose usefulness has been tied to a specific patron tend to become acutely aware of their position when that patron is removed. Jon did not offer a bribe. He did not threaten. He recommended Slynt through Ned for a royal commendation, a formal public recognition from Robert Baratheon of the City Watch's service in maintaining order during the political disruption surrounding the Lannister arrests. The commendation was read aloud at a small council session. Slynt's name was said by a king, in a room full of lords, in a context that attached the words loyal and dependable to it. Slynt found Jon in the corridor outside the council chamber afterward. His expression was the expression of a man who has just received something he wanted and is uncertain what it costs. The recommendation was Lord Stark's, Jon said, before Slynt could frame his question. The hand felt the watch deserved formal acknowledgement. The king agreed. I'm grateful, Slynt said. The crown values loyalty, Jon said. Not to the hand, not to any house, specifically without ambiguity, to the crown. He said it and moved on and did not look back to see how it landed. The second conversation happened 3 days later, in the same corridor, at a time Jon had arranged without appearing to arrange it. By the end of it, Janos Slynt understood, without anything having been stated in terms he could report as a threat, that the City Watch served the Iron Throne, that the Iron Throne was represented by Robert Baratheon and his hand, and that the kind of recognition recently extended was the kind of thing that continued for men who kept that understanding clear. He was not reliable in any durable sense. He was never going to be reliable. But he was, for now, pointed in a direction that was not actively hostile, and in King's Landing during the first weeks of a new administration, not actively hostile was worth something. The move against Littlefinger was staged in 2 parts, 3 weeks apart. The first was intelligence. Jon arranged for a specific piece of false information to reach Littlefinger through a channel Littlefinger trusted, a fabricated Northern gold reserve, recently assayed, the kind of financially significant news that would move immediately through anyone connected to Northern trade and whose pattern of movement would reveal the exact shape of the network it traveled. Within a week, 7 different lords had received some version of the false intelligence within 4 days of Jon placing it. Every one of them had a relationship with Littlefinger's operation that was now visible by the route the story had taken. The second was arithmetic. Ned Stark, as the new hand, requested the crown's financial ledgers. It was the most routine possible action for a man taking office, the kind of administrative housekeeping that no master of coin could reasonably object to without appearing to object to transparency itself. Tyrion reviewed the ledgers alongside Nestoris, and the review produced a document that was not an accusation but a comparison. What the records claimed against what the records showed, expressed as a running total. The morning of the arrest, Littlefinger was in his office. Ned presented the document. Littlefinger looked at the numbers, and looked at Tyrion, and looked at the Iron Bank representative, and opened his mouth to begin the alternative narrative, and then looked at the specific figures again, and stopped. He could not buy his way out of arithmetic. He was not executed. The argument was the same one that had been made at Winterfell about the Lannister twins, translated to a different context. A man with Littlefinger's particular knowledge of 20 years of corruption was worth more as a source of information than as an example. He was stripped of his position and held under guard. Within a week, he was talking. The geography of 20 years of bought judgments and purchased lords and secrets maintained at price came out of him with the quality of a man who has identified that the only card remaining is the information itself, and is playing it with the careful hand of someone who has been calculating angles his entire life and cannot quite stop even when the game is over. Names, amounts, arrangements. Every lord who had been purchased, every judicial outcome that had been sold, every secret that had been kept because it was profitable to keep it. Jon read the transcripts each evening in Ned's solar. He read them the way a general studies a map of enemy territory, not with satisfaction, but with the specific attention of someone who intends to build something on the ground that was being cleared. He sent a raven north before he slept. 2 lines sealed with plain wax, no sigil. Robb. The spider is in place. The coin man is contained. The watch is manageable. He sealed it and set it for the morning bird and went to bed in a city that did not know yet what it had let through its gates. 18,000 men is a sound before it is a sight. It is the sound of 1,000 fires assembled in the morning dark before the camp fully wakes. The sound of horses standing patient in their lines, and supply wagons settling on uneven ground, and men who have been sleeping outside long enough that they have stopped complaining about it and begun treating cold ground as the natural condition of human existence. Robb had heard this sound before, in a life that was gone, and what he felt now was not the pride of a young lord looking at the force he had raised. What he felt was closer to relief. The sound meant the thing was real and moving and in motion before Tywin Lannister had finished composing his response. He rode at the front of it. The men had been calling him the Young Wolf since the first week of the march. The name came from the Great Jon, who had ridden into the muster at the Long Lake Crossing, looked at Robb for 30 seconds with the appraising eye of a man who has been in the company of fighters his entire life, and announced to the assembled lords at the full carrying power of a voice that required no amplification that they were following a wolf north who had grown into a proper one going south. The name stuck the way names stuck in the north, without ceremony and permanently. He had been the young wolf in the first life too. The name had not saved him. What Robb Stark actually was, not the name, not the banner, not the pride the lords attached to riding under a Stark direwolf, was a general, an undefeated one. In the previous life, from Whispering Wood to Oxcross to every engagement along the Red Fork, he had not lost in the field. His record as a battlefield commander was without blemish. His record as a political actor was catastrophic. He had been destroyed not by an enemy who could match him when the ground was even and the lines were drawn, but by the agreements he had allowed to decay, the promises he had broken for reasons that felt sufficient until they were not, the lords whose grievances he had treated as smaller than his campaigns. This time, every military move was also a political move. Every alliance was secured with the clear understanding that an alliance is only as strong as the cost of breaking it, and Robb had spent considerable thought ensuring that cost was always set higher than the benefit of defection. He did not make war the same way twice. The twins came into sight on a gray morning in the 3rd week south of the Neck, 2 matching towers on either bank of the Green Fork, connected by the bridge that was the only reliable crossing for 30 miles in either direction. Robb had sent an envoy 3 weeks earlier, before the army had fully cleared the causeway, carrying 2 things. The first was a marriage proposal, not Robb's hand, a Glover's son, young, capable, the kind of match that represented genuine advancement for the Frey family tree without Robb conceding anything he could not afford to concede. Walder Frey's appetite for status was a documented quality. The man wanted his house to matter to great houses, wanted Frey daughters placed where they could accumulate influence, wanted formal acknowledgement that the crossing was worth something concrete to the people who needed it. The Glover match gave him a northern alliance and a foothold in a house that would be elevated by the changes coming in the south. He received the status. Robb did not give him a hostage. The second thing the envoy carried was a letter bearing Robert Baratheon's seal, provided by Ned as hand before the royal party had fully established itself in King's Landing. The letter stated in the direct language of a king issuing a legal instruction that the northern host moving south was operating under crown authority in support of the lawful administration of justice, and that any lord who impeded its passage was impeding the king's justice. Closing the twins to a crown military movement was treason. Walder Frey had survived 6 kings by the simple mechanism of never being visibly on the losing side early enough to be blamed for it. He had watched houses crushed by premature commitments, and he had learned over the course of a very long life that the lord who held the bridge was always in negotiation, and the art of negotiation was knowing what you wanted, knowing what was available, and determining which way the current was running before you committed to a bank. The current this season was running unmistakably north to south. The bridge was open when the column arrived. Robb crossed it at the head of the march with Brynden Tully at his left shoulder and the great Jon at his right, and in the great hall of the twins old Walder Frey shuffled out from behind his table, with his ancient limbs and his suspicious eyes, and the boundless self-satisfaction of a man who believes he has extracted the maximum available from a situation and extended his hand. Robb took it. The hand was dry and cool and papery in his grip. The hall smelled of old stone and wood smoke, and the particular staleness of a space that saw too many people and too little air. And Robb stood in it and looked at the old man's face. The pleased calculation behind the eyes, the private congratulation of someone who had just received something he wanted, and kept his own face as still as the stone beneath his boots. In another version of this moment, one that would never arrive in this life, this hall had been a feast table, and the music had changed and the doors had closed, and the hospitality of the phrase had expressed itself in a way that violated the oldest law of civilization and cost everything. He held the grip and looked at Walder Frey's eyes and felt nothing that showed. "Lord Frey," Robb said. "Lord Stark," said Walder Frey with the smile of a man who is certain he has won something. They released hands. The bridge was held. The column crossed through the afternoon in good order, and Robb did not look back when the last wagon cleared the far bank. By the time Tywin Lannister had received the ravens from Winterfell and King's Landing, assembled a complete picture of what had occurred, and begun composing his response, Robb had 18,000 infantry across the neck and moving south through the Riverlands at the pace of an army that knew where it was going and why. Every logistics decision had been made before the campaign began. Robb had drawn from exact memory of every supply failure from the First War, every position abandoned because the provisions did not arrive, every engagement nearly lost because the men were hungry and cold before the enemy found them. The supply caches had been pre-positioned along the route weeks before the march. The river crossings had been pre-negotiated with the relevant lords through careful ravens that framed each request as routine coordination rather than military planning. The captains had been briefed individually, each given his specific task and the reasoning behind it, so that when the column moved, it moved with the coherence of an organization that understood its own purpose. Great Jon Umber rode at the point of the vanguard. This was correct. The Great Jon's character was a fixed quantity, loud, violent, extremely difficult to stop once in motion, absolutely loyal to the blood, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of patient political calculation that made him dangerous when seated at a table and invaluable when positioned at the front of a moving army. The vanguard hit hard and kept moving, and the garrison commanders who saw it coming across the horizon arrived at their assessments of the situation with a speed that precluded extended deliberation. It also meant Robb could manage the political landscape from the column's middle, at a measured distance from the Great Jon's particular approach to problems that required negotiation rather than forward momentum. Brynden Tully rode with the cavalry. Catelyn's uncle, the Blackfish, who had refused marriage and title and every conventional Tully arrangement for 50 years, and had spent the intervening time fighting other people's wars with a skill that had outlasted the politics of each successive conflict, was one of the finest cavalry commanders in the Seven Kingdoms, and his presence in Robb's column was worth more in the Riverlands than any letter of introduction. Every house along the Trident watched the northern host move through their territory and read the Tully Fish and Black Banner running alongside the Stark Direwolf, and understood what they were being shown, that this was their war as much as the North's, that the cause had Tully blood behind it, that the lords of the river region were being offered a position before the position was assigned to them by someone else. They began declaring one by one as the column passed through their lands. Roose Bolton rode with the supply trains. He had received this assignment without visible reaction, which was characteristic of Bolton, and also characteristic of a man who had already understood the assignment before it was delivered. The supply lines were the worst posting in the campaign. Essential, unglamorous, offering no independent action and no opportunity for the kind of political visibility that ambitious men required to feel that a war was serving their interests. If Bolton intended treachery, And Robb assumed he did in the same calm way a mason assumes that stone is heavier than it looks. Then the supply lines gave him the least scope for it. Provisions either arrived or they did not. Numbers either balanced or they did not. The records were reviewed weekly by men whose specific loyalty was not to Bolton, a fact Robb had not communicated to Bolton. The column moved south. The Ravens moved in both directions, tracking the position of Tywin's host, monitoring the political situation in King's Landing, maintaining the thread of coordination between the army in the field and the political work Jon was executing in the capital. Robb read each incoming Raven in the saddle and filed the information and adjusted his thinking and sent responses that were short and specific and gave the recipient exactly what they needed without anything extra. He was not improvising. He had never in this life improvised. The army stopped at the intersection of the River Road and the Gold Road, where the western approach to King's Landing could be observed, and the route from Casterly Rock through the Westerlands met the road running south to the capital. Robb positioned the host across the junction and had the camp fortified in the standard manner and sent the Blackfish's cavalry on a wide survey of the surrounding terrain. He did not march on King's Landing. Jon was in King's Landing. The Ravens from the capital had been consistently ahead of schedule. Varys engaged, Littlefinger contained, the small council manageable, Robert alive and being carefully handled. The capital did not need an army. It needed what it had, which was Jon, operating with the full intelligence of a man who had already seen how this game was played and lost and had come back with notes. What the army needed to do was occupy a position where Tywin Lannister could not ignore it. 18,000 men at the crossroads between Casterly Rock's Road and the capital meant that Tywin, marching east with his 35,000 Westerlands host, could not reach King's Landing without first solving the problem of a well-supplied northern army fighting under explicit crown authority and positioned across the only reliable route. The military logic was straightforward: attack at considerable cost against a prepared defensive position, or halt, and a Lannister army halted in the Riverlands, unable to reach King's Landing, was a Lannister army that was not affecting anything. Robb was not an invader. He had not marched south to take a city or depose a king. He was the Warden of the North, operating under a royal seal, positioned between a hostile force and the capital that Jon was securing. Every lord watching the board had to calculate what it meant to attack him, to spill the blood of crowned soldiers in a crown-authorized operation, to rescue a queen already convicted of treason. Most lords arrived at the same answer. He sat with the Great Jon at the evening fire, and the Great Jon drank and told stories about previous campaigns, and laughed at them with the full commitment of a man who had survived everything he was laughing about. And Robb ate and listened and said little, and let his mind run through supply projections, and the likely shape of Tywin's response, and the position of Bolton's provision wagons, and the timing of the next Raven from King's Landing. The silence from Casterly Rock would break within the week. The response would be a large one. He was 17 years old. He had made every available mistake in a life that was gone, and from which the lessons had survived intact. He waited for the response, and let the army rest and did not make the mistakes again. The news reached Tywin Lannister in pieces, which was the worst way for news to arrive. The first Raven had been a report of unusual activity at Winterfell, guards repositioned, a Lannister escort redirected to stables at dawn. The second, 2 days after, confirmed the arrest. The third reported the departure of the royal party with the prisoners in custody. By the time Tywin possessed a complete picture of what had occurred in that northern castle, the decisions that might have altered the outcome had already been made by other people in rooms he had not been present in. He had been in this position before, reacting to events rather than setting them, and he managed it as he managed everything, without visible disturbance, with the cold and refined fury of a man who has spent 40 years ensuring the world arranged itself according to his designs, and is now watching a specific arrangement dismantle itself without yet understanding whose hands are on it. His children, his greatest achievement and his deepest embarrassment, and those two categories had always overlapped more than he permitted himself to examine. Cersei in chains, Jaime in chains. His grandchildren, positioned to inherit the Iron Throne, carrying the Lannister name into the next generation, legally bastards. Legally nothing. His gold could not travel fast enough to change any of this. He called his lords and mustered the Westerlands host, 35,000 men, the best-equipped army in Westeros, funded by 3 centuries of Lannister gold and hardened by the mountain campaigns that had kept the western lands in order across generations. He pointed it east. He marched, because Tywin Lannister's answer to a failing political situation was always, eventually, force, and the problem before him had a geographical solution. Reach King's Landing before the situation became permanent. He would break whatever was in his way. Robb had known Tywin would march. The certainty was not intelligence, it was character knowledge, the kind that accrues from studying a man whose decisions followed the same internal logic, regardless of circumstance. Tywin Lannister did not absorb political defeats and revise his methods. When the architecture of influence failed, he applied military pressure to produce a new architecture. This had worked for 40 years because 40 years of Westerosi politics had produced no one both willing and positioned to absorb the pressure correctly. Robb was positioned correctly. The northern host had occupied the River Road Junction 2 weeks before Tywin's column cleared the Westerlands border, which meant that when Lannister outriders made first contact with Robb's advanced positions, they reported back to a march that had already been moving for 20 days, with another 3 weeks of road ahead of it. The army was fit and professional and well-equipped and hungry in the small, accumulating way of armies that had been moving at campaign pace without the supply replenishment that should have been waiting at the midpoint depots. The depots had been empty. Brynden Tully had ridden the cavalry in a wide arc south of the River Road on the 4th day after the camp was established, circling around the projected line of Tywin's march with 1,200 horses, and the specific purpose of a man who had been executing this kind of work since before most of his riders were born. He did not engage the vanguard. He engaged the wagons. Supply trains move slowly, their guards are configured for bandit deterrence rather than cavalry assault at speed, and the Blackfish moved fast and burned what could not be carried, and took what could and was gone before the Lannister cavalry could organize a coherent response. He did it twice more in the following 10 days, from different angles each time, vanishing back into the Riverlands terrain before pursuit developed into anything useful. The fires were visible on the horizon after dark from Robb's position. He watched each one from the edge of the camp and said nothing and made a mark on the map. The Lannister supply situation deteriorated at the rate of arithmetic. Tywin read the supply reports. He did the arithmetic. He arrived at his decision with the clean efficiency of a man for whom decisions were a form of construction, built precisely, not revisited. He could halt. A halted army consuming its remaining provisions in the Riverlands while ravens traveled back and forth to King's Landing was an army that produced nothing and projected nothing. He could turn for home, which surrendered the initiative entirely and gave every watching lord the image of Tywin Lannister marching east with 35,000 men and stopping because a northern boy had put soldiers across a road. He would not retreat. He attacked. 3 days, Robb had estimated 3, and it was 3. Tywin came at the River Road position with his full main body on the first morning and found fortified lines that had been prepared not for a single day's action but for sustained engagement. Earthworks dug to the depth that made direct assault expensive, the southern flank anchored on the river, the northern flank absorbed into a woodline the Blackfish occupied and had rendered functionally impassable. Robb did not counterattack, he held. The Great Jon held the center with the specific, immovable quality that was his primary contribution to any engagement. Not the tactical flexibility of a versatile commander, but the absolute stubbornness of a man who had decided where he was standing and had not yet met a force that moved him. The Lannister vanguard hit the center in the first morning and reformed and hit it in the afternoon and produced the same result. That night the Lannister camp had the quality of an army that had worked hard and eaten less than it needed to, and was, without discussion, calculating how many days of this remained viable. On the second morning Tywin sent cavalry wide to the right, looking for the northern flank. The Blackfish met them in the woodline with 1,200 horses that had been rested and provisioned, while the Lannister cavalry had been covering 30 miles of road. The engagement lasted 2 hours and resolved cleanly in Brynden Tully's favor. Tywin sent cavalry at the southern flank on the third morning with the methodical persistence of a man who does not permit failed auctions to become abandoned ones until he has confirmed them failed from every available angle. Robb held. He stood at his command position on the second morning and watched the lines and ate bread and did not counterattack, which was the discipline the situation required, and the discipline that cost the most to maintain when every trained instinct pressed toward closing the distance and finishing what had been started. He had won every pitched battle in the previous life. He understood the pull. He also understood, with the precision of a man who had examined his own failures in exact detail, that decisive engagement was precisely what Tywin needed him to want. A committed battle on even terms where Tywin's numerical advantage and tactical experience could be brought to bear without the complication of logistics. The pull was information about what his opponent required. Robb declined. Neither army had broken at the end of 3 days. One army had eaten, the other had not eaten enough. The gap between those conditions expressed itself not in broken lines or retreating flanks, but in the quietness of the Lannister camp after dark, and the marginally reduced sharpness in the third morning's assault. Still capable, still professional, still dangerous, but with the specific quality of men working harder than their bodies were currently resourced to sustain. Robb watched it and waited. In King's Landing, in the Hand Solar, Jon had been constructing the document for 6 days. The content was not complicated. It was a royal order, Robert's seal, Ned's signature as witness, language Jon had drafted and Ned had revised, and both of them had shaped toward a single purpose. Presenting it had required managing Robert's mood with the care of someone who had spent weeks learning the precise conditions under which this specific man was most capable of decisive action. Tired of the city, missing the directness of what wars had once felt like, wanting resolution rather than continued management. Tywin is marching with 35,000 men to overturn a legal proceeding and free prisoners already convicted. Jon had said, he said it the way he said things to Robert, directly, without performance, in the register of a soldier describing a tactical problem. The question is whether the crown allows that to stand. If he reaches King's Landing with his army intact, every lord in Westeros draws the same lesson, that Lannister gold overrides the king's law. Robert had looked at him. You want me to give him the choice between standing down and losing everything? I want you to give him the law, Jon said, and let him decide what to do with it. Robert had signed it. The order was precise. Tywin Lannister was commanded to stand down his host immediately, disband his men to the Westerlands, and appear before the Iron Throne in King's Landing within 30 days to answer for the march. Failure to comply within 3 days of receiving the order constituted open rebellion. Open rebellion carried attainder. House Lannister stripped of Casterly Rock, stripped of every title and holding in the Seven Kingdoms, everything Tywin had spent his life constructing, dismantled by the written authority of a crown. The Raven left King's Landing 4 days before the third morning's assault. It arrived in the Lannister camp on the afternoon of the third day, carried by a bird that found the camp through the smoke of a supply fire the Blackfish had set 2 miles west of the road. Tywin read it once. He read it again. He stood in the command tent with the paper in his hand and the ambient sounds of a large camp beyond the canvas. Men moving, horses settling, the particular murmur of an army that has been in contact for 3 days and is waiting to understand what the 4th day requires of it. He held the paper and thought about the sequence of decisions that had produced this outcome. The arrest in Winterfell, the march he had been unable to intercept, the supply wagons burning on 3 separate occasions, the fortified position on the river road that had absorbed 3 days of sustained assault without breaking, the Raven now in his hand bearing the seal of a king he had, for 20 years, managed through the uncomplicated mechanism of making himself indispensable. He was looking at a legal instrument, not a military one. And legal instruments had a different weight than armies. The weight of things that were true before enforcement and remained true after enforcement was no longer relevant. If he defied the order, he became a rebel against a crown operating with full legal authority, and every lord currently watching from behind castle walls would have to decide whether to support that cause. Most of them would not. Most of them had learned at various points in the preceding generation what the cost of opposing Lannister interest looked like. They would not pay a comparable cost to support a Lannister who had become the rebel. The army he needed was the army he had. The army he had could not break Robb Stark's position. Without weeks more of engagement, his supply situation could not sustain. The road behind him was long and the road ahead of him was held. He folded the paper and pressed it into the chest piece beneath his cloak. He did not show it to his commanders. He issued orders in the clipped manner of a man who has made a decision and will not discuss it further. The host reversed its orientation over the following hour, the column reforming along the western road it had come by. The camp broke efficiently because Lannister armies were well drilled, and the march west began in the gray of the late afternoon. Robb received the scout's report at dusk. Lannister camp moving, not east but west. The column turned toward home. He stood at the edge of his position and watched the dust of the Lannister march catch the last of the light above the tree line. It rose and caught the orange and held it for a long moment, and then the light went and the dust was just dust in the early dark. He did not celebrate. He had not celebrated any outcome in the previous life, and the lesson had not been that celebration was wrong. It had been that the field was only one part of the problem, and the part already solved was never the part that killed you. The road to King's Landing was open. Tywin was withdrawing. Robert was alive. There was still a great deal of work left. He went back into the camp and ate and let the army rest and drafted the Raven to Jon in the clean, particular quiet of a fire that had burned down to coals. The riverlands dark around him, position held. Lannister host stands down. Begin the next stage. He sealed it and sent it and watched the bird disappear south into the dark. The forest was the one place Robert Baratheon still made sense. The city had become a thing he moved through rather than commanded, full of arrangements he did not fully understand, managed by a hand who understood them completely, generating a daily flow of decisions that required him to sign documents rather than make choices. The woman he had married was in a cell. The children he had raised were in Stark custody. The war he had built his entire identity around had produced a victor who was also the man most responsible for starting it, and that man's best friend was now quietly reorganizing the administration of the realm in the hands Solar one floor below. He went hunting. Because the forest did not require him to understand political architecture, because a boar was a problem solvable with a spear and a steady hand, because movement was tolerable in a way that stillness had ceased to be. The boar found him in the third hour. In the first life, Cersei had kept the wine cup full through a proxy, Lancel, reliable and obedient, refilling it until Robert's reactions were slower than his own confidence accounted for. There was no Cersei now, no Lancel, no arranged cup. The wine Robert drank that morning was ordinary. What was not ordinary, and had never been ordinary regardless of what anyone poured into his cup, was the man himself. Jon had spent 6 weeks on the road with Robert Baratheon, and understood, with the clarity of close observation, that a man his size and condition who trusted his past strength above all present evidence to the contrary, who needed movement the way other men needed air, did not require assistance to be in danger from a boar. The cup had been a factor, it had not been the only one. Jon had not arranged the hunt and had not prevented it, and had made his preparations accordingly, in the documents drafted and conversations staged, and a room made ready, for the morning it came. He was at Robert's bedside within an hour of the litter arriving at the Red Keep. The room smelled of blood and tallow and the sharp medicinal bitterness of whatever Pycelle had applied to the wound before Ned had placed him in the corner with his parchment and his ink. The wound was deep, a tusk below the ribs, the kind of injury survivable in a fit man and not survivable in a man who had spent 20 years replacing fitness with wine in excess. Robert's body had made a specific agreement with its own decline, and the decline had collected on the agreement. He was conscious, that was what mattered. Jon sat in the chair at the bedside and held no performance. He had stopped performing anything around Robert months ago on the road south, when Robert had first responded to him as a person rather than an appendage of Ned Stark's household. He sat and was present, and Robert looked at him with the particular clarity that comes to the dying when pain has burned through the thickness of everything else. "I keep thinking about her," Robert said. His voice was roughened but not diminished, the voice of a man who was still, in some essential way, himself. "That surprise you?" "No," Jon said. "I never stopped." He said it plainly, not as a confession requiring absolution, as a fact delivered to a person he had determined, over months, would not perform sympathy at him in return. 20 years of Cersei, and I never stopped once. She was an empty chair. Everything about that marriage, the children, the court, the whole performance, it was an empty chair where something real was supposed to sit. The candles moved in a draft from the window. Ned stood near the door with the expression of a man who had heard versions of this conversation before and had decided staying was correct. "You ever loved someone who stayed with you like that?" Robert asked, "where it didn't matter how long or what followed after, just present, always." Jon was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes." Robert looked at him. "Good," he said. "Good that you know what it is." A silence settled between them. Outside, the city continued its ordinary noise, commerce and argument and the ambient evidence of 500,000 people living without knowledge of what was being decided in this room. Jon looked at the dying man's face and made his choice. "She had a son," Jon said. Robert's eyes did not move from the ceiling. A long moment passed in which the quality of the air in the room altered. Not louder, not more charged, but shifted the way a room shifts, when something that has been true and silent for a long time is finally spoken aloud. "She had a son," Jon said again. "He's alive." Robert turned his head. The old rage that had carried him through Robert's rebellion and 20 years of kingship moved under the surface of his face. Visible, recognizable, the engine that had powered everything he had ever done. and then something came up through it from further down. Something that had been there longer than the rage, and had the texture of a weight carried past the point of being felt, right up until the moment of setting it down. "Who?" Robert said. Jon met his eyes. "Look at me." Robert looked. He had looked at Jon dozens of times on the road south and in the capital, had registered Ned in him, had found him direct and unusual and oddly familiar in ways he had chosen not to examine too closely. He looked now with the deliberate intention of examining, and what he found was not Ned. The dark hair was Lyanna's. The gray eyes were Lyanna's. The particular quality of stillness, the composure that held under direct attention rather than breaking before it, was hers too, the northern seriousness he had loved and could not name when he had first loved it. And, beneath all of that, in the structure of the jaw and the set of the bones, and something indefinable in the architecture of the eyes themselves, something older, something that did not come from the north, and had not come from Ned, something that had been burning in a single line for 300 years. Robert stared at him for a long time. "She married him," Robert said. It was not a question. "Yes," Jon said. The room was very still. Robert lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and breathed through something that had no clean name. Jon did not attempt to name it. He waited. A long time passed. "Does Ned know I know?" Robert said, "No." "Good." The corner of Robert's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shadow of the expression that would have been a smile in a different circumstance. Ned would cry. Jon said nothing, but something in his chest eased at the sound of it. The humor. Specifically Baratheon, the man making a remark about his best friend's emotional honesty while dying of a boar wound because that was who he was, and he had no intention of being anyone else at the end of it. Robert dictated the document in his last lucid hour. Ned stood at the bedside. Grand Maester Pycelle sat in the corner with his parchment and his ink, writing in the careful hand of a man who had been made to understand, clearly and without ambiguity, by both Ned Stark and Jon Snow over the preceding weeks, that his active cooperation was the instrument by which he remained Grand Maester, and that his alternatives were not ones he would prefer. Pycelle wrote. Ned witnessed. Robert spoke. The document named Aegon Targaryen, true-born son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms before the rebellion, and Lady Lyanna Stark of Winterfell, as the chosen successor to the Iron Throne in preference to all other claimants. It named Cersei Lannister's children as born of incest and confirmed fraud, carrying no valid succession right. It named Stannis and Renly Baratheon as collateral kinsmen, not heirs in the direct line. It stated Robert's recognition that the Targaryen succession had been interrupted by conquest in 283 AC, and that this document restored the rightful line. And then it stated, in Robert's own dictated words, that the wrong done to Prince Rhaegar Targaryen's family had been real, had been done by Robert Baratheon personally, and in the name of the realm, and was hereby acknowledged. Robert paused after that section. "Strange thing to write," he said, "acknowledging a wrong you spend your whole life calling justice." "It's the truth," Jon said. "Yes." A silence. "Stranger still that the truth is sitting in the chair next to me." He gestured for Pycelle to continue. The document concluded with Robert's personal instruction that the realm accept the transition without violence, that Aegon Targaryen had been confirmed by the sworn testimony of Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Hand of the King, and by the independent testimony of Howland Reed of Greywater Watch, who had been present at the circumstances of Aegon's birth, and that any lord contesting the succession did so in direct contravention of the final expressed will of King Robert of House Baratheon. Robert signed it. His hand was not entirely steady. That was the wound, not the man. "Stannis will argue," Robert said. "He always argues. That's his defining quality. You give him a fact he doesn't like and he argues it from every available angle until he runs out of angles, and then he accepts it and acts on it like he agreed all along." "Yes," Jon said, "but he will argue through lawyers and ravens. That takes time. And the time is enough." Robert looked at him. The expression on his face at the end was not peace. Robert Baratheon had never been a man to whom peace came naturally, and it would have been wrong to put it there. It was something with the shape of resolution, a thing completed in the right direction, against considerable odds by choices made correctly at the last available moment. "You'd better be worth it," Robert said. The voice was quieter now, running toward its end. "She'd better not have given everything for someone ordinary." "I'll try not to be," Jon said. Robert closed his eyes. He did not open them again. Ned sealed the document under his own signet and sent it under guard to the record chambers with 2 Stark household men who would not leave it until it was registered in triplicate. Pycelle was escorted to his quarters. The room was cleared. Jon sat alone with Robert Baratheon for a few minutes before the servants came. He did not plan. There would be time for planning. He sat in the chair by the bed in the tallow light and listened to the city and let the moment be what it was. The end of one chapter and the beginning of several others, all of them harder and longer and more uncertain than anything that had come before. Stannis Baratheon's letter arrived at the Red Keep 6 days after Robert's death. It was written in Stannis's own hand, no intermediary, no scribe. The letters formed with the compressed precision of a man who does not waste motion in anything he undertakes. It was also brief in the way Stannis was brief, stripped to the essential point, carrying no diplomatic cushioning, offering nothing that had not been weighed and found necessary. You have 1 year, show me that you can hold what you have taken. After that, I will decide. No address, no salutation, the seal of Dragonstone in the wax. Jon read it twice. He set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. 1 year was not grace. Stannis was not extending generosity. He was applying process, the rigid proceduralism of a man who believed even claims he found offensive deserved structured examination before condemnation. He was extending observation, which was a different thing entirely, and it was the thing Jon had calculated he would extend when the succession document reached Dragonstone. Stannis would not rebel against a legal instrument signed by his own brother without first establishing that the instrument had failed on its own terms. He would wait and measure and keep his conclusions to himself, and at the end of a year he would have either a reason to submit or a reason to march. 1 year to hold the Iron Throne. 1 year to demonstrate a reign that made rebellion look like the worst available choice. 1 year to stabilize the finances, establish the administration, secure the North, manage the lords who were still deciding which way to face, and begin, quietly, practically without announcing it to anyone who did not already know, the preparations for the thing coming from beyond the wall that none of the political calculations of the South would matter against if it arrived before they were ready. It was not a comfortable year. It was enough of one. Jon picked up the letter and considered the brazier, then set it back down. He would keep it, evidence of process in the event that process became relevant. He pulled the first document of the morning toward him and read the first line and began to work. The great sept of Baelor held them all, lords who had ridden for weeks, and lords whose ravens had arrived before them, and lords whose attendance was a concession rather than a celebration. They filled the nave in their house colors, and their private calculations, and their collective understanding that presence here meant something specific, and absence would have meant something worse. The autumn light came through the high windows in long angled columns and fell on stone floors worn smooth by the feet of 100 coronations. Jon stood at the altar in gray and black, not Targaryen red, not Baratheon gold, gray and black, the colors of the North, of Winterfell, of the man who had raised him in the house that had shaped him and the woman who had died in a tower in Dorne, to bring him into a world that had not been ready for him. The choice had been deliberate and was read as one. Every lord in the sept who possessed the political competence to understand it received the same message. The dynasty that had ended in fire and betrayal was not being revived behind the same name. What was being crowned was something that had not existed before. A king made of 2 bloodlines and claimed by neither completely, carrying the inheritance of both and the limitations of neither exclusively. The High Septon anointed him. The oaths were given. The crown was placed. Jon's face throughout was the face of a boy who had been prepared for this moment by means the room could not have imagined and who understood with complete clarity what the crown weighed and what it cost. He looked at the room while the ceremony finished around him. Varys, at the back of the sept, was allowing himself an expression he normally kept entirely internal. 17 years of building toward something, and the something had arrived, not precisely the thing he had constructed toward, but perhaps more useful. The face held a kind of private arithmetic, resolving into a sum he found acceptable. The northern lords stood straight in their fur-edged cloaks, weather-hardened from the road south, present because Jon was Lyanna's son and Ned's ward and the young wolf's brother, and those 3 facts together constituted sufficient reason. Stannis Baratheon stood near the front, with the compressed and rigid posture of a man who has accepted a fact he dislikes and has decided that giving outward indication of the dislike serves no purpose. He had come because not coming would have been a declaration he was not yet prepared to make. He watched a Targaryen take the throne his brother had held, and his face disclosed nothing, Jon noted it and made no approach. The ceremony ended. Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name, was king. Robb Stark was named Hand of the King the following morning. The court had opinions about the age of 17 for the second highest office in the realm. The opinions circulated for approximately a week. They stopped circulating when enough of the lords present recalled that Robb had outgeneraled Tywin Lannister in the field with a logistics interdiction and a 3-day holding action that had ended a 35,000-man campaign without a decisive engagement. At an age when most sons of great houses were still arguing about horsemanship. The whispering stopped. The work began. Their first formal act as king in hand was a complete financial audit of the Iron Throne's accounts, conducted in the Hand Solar with Tyrion Lannister at the table and the Iron Bank's envoy in the chair across from him. Littlefinger's replacement as Master of Coin was not the obvious choice to anyone who had not spent time watching Tyrion in a room with numbers. It was the only correct choice to anyone who had. He was the most qualified person in the Seven Kingdoms for the role, and the only Lannister with both the intelligence to do it and the incentive to do it honestly. His siblings' disgrace had freed him from the architecture of a family whose interests had never coincided with his own. "The Lannister gold is not gone," Tyrion said at the first session, looking at the preliminary figures with the expression of a man who has inherited a complicated estate and is choosing to view the complications as interesting rather than catastrophic. "It has been very creatively borrowed against. The distinction is significant. What does it fund?" Jon asked. "Whatever we decide it funds," Tyrion said, which is the first time in my life that sentence has been true of Lannister money. It would fund what was coming. That was the answer, and Tyrion did not need to know the full shape of it yet to begin building the mechanism. Longclaw had come south by royal request. A letter from the new king's household to Lord Commander Jeor Mormont at Castle Black, formal, specific, carrying the weight of a crown whose first decree had tripled the Night's Watch budget, and whose standing orders had made Castle Black the most closely monitored outpost in the realm. The letter asked for the Valyrian steel sword held by the Lord Commander, in the service of the Crown's preparations against the threat the Night's Watch understood better than any southern lord. Mormont had sent it within a week, which was the response of a man who recognized both the request's legitimacy and the authority behind it. Longclaw came south with Jon and was worn openly at the Red Keep. The court found it unusual for a king to carry a bastard sword. Jon explained, "Once to anyone who raised it, it kills what needs killing. That's the only kind of sword worth wearing." After the second time, the question stopped being asked. Ice remained at Winterfell. This was correct and was not reconsidered. The great sword of House Stark was Robb's to keep, the symbol and substance of northern authority, and the North needed both the symbol and the substance in a way that King's Landing did not. It would be there when it was needed. It was already where it needed to be. The cat's paw dagger, recovered from Littlefinger's personal effects during the arrest, was sealed in a locked case and sent north to Winterfell by Stark messenger. It was a small blade, unremarkable in weight and design, significant only to the people who understood its history. It went into a vault. One day that history would need to be told to someone who did not yet know it. Until then, the vault was the right place. Royal envoys went to the Vale and to the Reach. Bronze Jon Royce of Runestone, whose loyalty to Ned Stark's memory was as strong as his loyalty to anything in the world, received the envoy, read the request, and agreed within a day. His ancestral Valyrian steel blade would be available to the crown in any declared national emergency. Royce asked only that the request be made formally, as a matter of record. Randyll Tarly at Hornhill received the envoy, read the request, and did not agree. He was not a man who was moved by royal charters. He was moved by the kind of reasoning that made alternatives to agreement appear less attractive than agreement. And the second envoy that traveled to Hornhill carried a different kind of message. The kind that described, in plain terms, what happened to houses that refused a king's legitimate request during a period of national preparation. Tarly received it with the cold composure of a man who respects force even when it is applied to him. He had not refused yet. Jon had not expected him to refuse immediately. The conversation would continue. A sealed letter was prepared for Pentos, for Daenerys Targaryen wherever she was. It was written in High Valyrian. Sam had pressed a battered grammar on Jon in his first year at the Wall. "You'll never need it, and that's precisely the reason to learn it." And Jon had worked through it across the long winter nights of Castle Black's library, a dead language, and a living cold and nothing else sensible to do with either. He had never thought to mention it. No one had ever thought to ask. The letter did not reveal everything. It was not the moment for everything. What it said, in the measured language of a king writing to someone whose trust needed to be earned before it could be used, was this: that her brother was alive, that he held the Iron Throne, that he was not her enemy, that the wrong done to her family was being formally acknowledged by the new administration of the realm, and that he would be waiting for her when she was ready to come home. Daenerys Targaryen was somewhere in the Dothraki Sea. She had not yet discovered what she was. The Raven would find her eventually. Ravens always did. Jon's first decree as king had been issued the day after Robert died, before the coronation, before any title was formally confirmed. In the capacity of a man who was not yet king and was not willing to wait, the Night's Watch budget was tripled. The lords of every major house received letters requiring them to send able-bodied men north to fill the depleted ranks of the Watch, framed as a crown obligation with specific timelines and specific consequences for non-compliance. A standing order was issued to Castle Black. Any report of activity beyond the wall was to reach the Hand and the King directly, before it reached the general circulation of the Watch's internal correspondence, before it reached maesters, before it reached anyone who might choose to interpret it as something other than what it was. Sam Tarly was at the Citadel. He had left for Old Town quietly months ago, on the instruction of Jon's Raven and the cooperation of his father's disapproval, which had, paradoxically, made the departure easier rather than harder. He was studying what the maesters had never considered worth studying: the records of the Long Night, the documents about dragonglass and Valyrian steel, and the specific properties of things that killed what ordinary steel did not. He wrote to Jon once a month, long, careful letters full of things that mattered. At Winterfell, Bran Stark moved through his days with his wolves and his strange dreams. He was not yet the thing he would become. The transition was years away, and the path to it had been altered by events that had not occurred as they had occurred before, but he was already watching things the others in the castle could not see. He mentioned it occasionally, in the offhand way of children who do not yet understand that not everyone sees what they see. Robb's letters north noted it without alarm. Jon read those notes and understood them and kept them. The preparations were not complete. They would not be complete for years. Some of them would not be complete in time. Robb came south in the late autumn, when the last of the administrative arrangements had been settled enough for the Hand to leave King's Landing for a week. And on the evening of his second day in the capital, they stood together on the walls of the Red Keep in the last of the daylight. The city spread below them. 500,000 people going about the ordinary business of ordinary lives, trading and arguing and feeding children, and doing the 1,000 unremarkable things that constituted the continued existence of the largest settlement in Westeros. None of them were looking north. None of them were thinking about the wall or about what lay beyond it, or about the specific quality of cold that had nothing to do with winter. Jon and Robb were looking north. They stood in silence for a long time with the wind coming off the water and the first stars beginning to resolve out of the darkening sky to the east. Below them, the city lights were coming on one by one, the torches and the candles and the hearth fires that made King's Landing look, from the walls, like something beautiful and permanent and entirely unaware of its own fragility. "We have the gold," Jon said. Robb nodded. "We have the men, and we have the steel." Jon looked down at Longclaw at his hip. 4 blades confirmed, 1 conditional, the registry established, the decree in place. It was a start. It was not enough. It won't be enough. Robb turned to look at him, not surprised, not contradicting, the look of a man who has known this since the gods would, and has been building anyway because building was the only honest response to knowing. "No," Robb said, "but it's a start." They stood there until the dark finished arriving, until the city below had become a field of small fires, and the sky above had become the thing it was at night, cold and clear and indifferent, with the stars arranged exactly as they had been arranged for thousands of years, and would be arranged for thousands more, whether the people beneath them survived what was coming or did not. 2 wolves watching north. "Ready this time? Let us know what you'd like to see next." The end.